The crackling of burning wood echoed through the Washington state wilderness on a crisp morning in March 2024. Detective Sarah Chen stepped out of her patrol vehicle, her breath forming small clouds in the mountain air. What she was about to discover in this remote cabin would challenge everything she thought she knew about the possible and impossible. 30 years. That's how long the Henderson couple had been missing. 30 years since Robert Henderson, 45, and his wife Margaret, 42, had vanished without a trace from their secluded retreat in the heart of the Cascade Mountains. And yet, as Detective Chen approached the weathered log cabin, smoke was still rising from its chimney, as if the couple had just stepped out for a morning walk. "This can't be right," Chen muttered, checking her GPS coordinates against the file in her hand. The case had been officially cold since 1995, filed away with dozens of other unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. But a recent tip from a hiking group had brought her here, to this impossible scene. 3 days earlier, Detective Chen had been reviewing cold cases in her cramped office at the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department when her phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Webb, a veteran mountaineer who'd been exploring the remote areas of the North Cascades for over 20 years. "Detective, you're gonna think I'm crazy," Webb had said, his voice shaky with excitement and confusion. "I found the Henderson cabin, the one from the missing persons case in '94, and there's smoke coming from the chimney." Chen had initially dismissed the call as another false lead. The Henderson case had generated dozens of supposed sightings over the years, people claiming to see the couple in grocery stores, gas stations, even on beaches in Mexico. All had proven to be cases of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. But Webb was different. He was a respected member of the local search and rescue team, a man whose word carried weight in the tight-knit community of outdoor enthusiasts. When he insisted on meeting Chen in person, bringing with him fresh photographs and GPS coordinates, she began to take him seriously. "I've been up to that area maybe a dozen times over the years," Webb explained during their meeting, spreading topographical maps across Chen's desk. "The cabin's always been dark, locked up tight, but 3 days ago I saw smoke. Fresh smoke, Detective, and I could swear I smelled coffee brewing." The Henderson cabin sat in one of the most isolated regions of the North Cascade Mountains, accessible only by a grueling 4-hour hike through dense forest and across treacherous creek beds. The couple had purchased the property in 1992 as a retreat from their busy lives in Seattle. Robert was a successful software engineer, Margaret a respected pediatric nurse. They'd spent weekends and vacations there, relishing the complete disconnection from modern life. The cabin had no electricity, no phone lines, no internet. Water came from a natural spring, heat from the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room. It was the kind of place where people went to truly disappear from the world, which made their actual disappearance all the more mysterious. Detective Chen had studied the original case files extensively before making the trek to the cabin. The investigation in 1994 had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Robert and Margaret had told their neighbors they were heading to the cabin for a long weekend in early December. Their car had been found at the trailhead, properly parked and locked. But when they failed to return to work the following Tuesday and subsequent phone calls went unanswered, their employer had contacted authorities. The first search party hadn't reached the cabin until 5 days after the Hendersons were supposed to have returned. Washington state had been hit by one of the worst early winter storms in decades, dumping over 3 feet of snow and making travel through the mountains virtually impossible. When rescuers finally arrived, they found the cabin empty but undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no indication of where the couple might have gone. Now, 30 years later, Chen found herself standing before that same cabin, watching smoke curl impossibly from its chimney. The structure looked exactly as it had in the crime scene photos from 1994, weathered but solid, its windows dark and revealing nothing of the interior. Chen approached slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. Training and experience had taught her to expect the unexpected, but this situation defied all logic. She called out, her voice echoing through the forest clearing. "Whatcom County Sheriff's Department? Is anyone inside?" Silence. Only the sound of wind through the pine trees and that persistent crackling from within the cabin. Chen circled the structure, noting that the windows were too dirty and covered with decades of grime to see through clearly. The front door was solid wood, weathered grey by years of mountain weather. She tried the handle, locked, just as it had been found 30 years ago. Moving around to the back of the cabin, Chen discovered something that made her pulse quicken. A small window near what she assumed was the kitchen area had a clear spot in the dirt and grime, as if someone had recently wiped it clean from the inside. Cupping her hands around her eyes, Chen peered through the glass and felt her world shift on its axis. The interior of the cabin looked as if it had been frozen in time, but not in the way of an abandoned building slowly decaying. Instead, it appeared as if the Henderson couple had just stepped out for a few minutes. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, steam rising from its surface. Fresh fruit, apples, oranges, bananas filled a bowl on the counter, showing no signs of age or decay. But it was the fireplace that truly defied explanation. Flames danced cheerfully in the hearth, consuming logs that appeared freshly cut. The fire burned with the same intensity it might have had if someone had just added new wood moments before Chen's arrival. Yet according to every record, every witness statement, every piece of evidence gathered over 3 decades, no one had been to this cabin since the Henderson couple vanished in December 1994. Chen pulled out her phone to call for backup, but found no signal, not unusual this deep in the mountains. She would have to make the decision alone, break into the cabin now and potentially contaminate a crime scene, or hike 4 hours back to civilization and risk whatever evidence might be inside disappearing again. She chose to enter. Using her tactical knife, Chen carefully pried at the lock on the front door until she heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The door swung open with a soft creak, and she stepped into what felt like a time capsule. The smell hit her immediately. Not the musty, stale air she expected from a building that had been sealed for 30 years, but the warm, inviting scents of burning wood, fresh coffee, and something that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen during the holidays. Cinnamon, perhaps, or nutmeg. Everything was exactly as it should be in a lived-in cabin. A flannel shirt hung from the back of a wooden chair. Reading glasses sat folded next to an open book on the mantelpiece. The kitchen counter held not just the bowl of fresh fruit Chen had seen through the window, but also a loaf of bread that felt soft to the touch when she carefully pressed against it through an evidence glove. Chen documented everything with her phone's camera, taking hundreds of photographs from every possible angle. She noted the titles of books on the shelves, mostly classics and nature guides from the early 1990s. She observed the contents of the refrigerator, which, despite having no electrical power, was somehow keeping milk fresh and vegetables crisp. But her attention kept returning to the fireplace. The flames continued to burn steadily, consuming wood that should have been nothing but ash decades ago. Chen approached cautiously and noticed something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the mantelpiece, in what appeared to be fresh scratches in the wood, were 2 sets of initials, RH plus MH. Below that, a date that shouldn't exist. Dec 15, 2023. Still here, still waiting. December 15th, 2023. Less than 4 months ago. Chen's hand trembled as she photographed the carving. If this was some kind of hoax, it was an elaborate one. If it wasn't a hoax, then she was dealing with something that challenged the fundamental laws of nature. She began a systematic search of the cabin, looking for any clues that might explain the impossible scene. In the bedroom, she found a diary sitting open on the nightstand. The handwriting was feminine, flowing, Margaret Henderson's, according to samples Chen had studied from the original case file. The most recent entry was dated March 10th, 2024, just 5 days ago. "The detective is coming soon," the entry read. "We can feel it in the way the fire burns, in the way time moves differently here. We've been waiting so long to tell our story, to explain why we couldn't leave, why we couldn't grow old in the world below. She'll understand this, Detective Chen. She has to understand, because she's the first one who's been meant to find us." Chen felt goosebumps rise on her arms. How could the diary know her name? How could it predict her arrival? She flipped back through the pages, finding entries that spanned the entire 30 years since the Hendersons' disappearance. The early entries described confusion and fear as Robert and Margaret realized they couldn't leave the cabin property. Any attempt to hike back to their car resulted in them somehow ending up back at the front door, as if the mountain itself was keeping them prisoner. Later, entries spoke of acceptance and eventually a strange kind of contentment. They wrote about how time moved differently in their pocket of the world, how they aged only months while years passed in the outside world. They described visitations from other missing persons, hikers and campers who had vanished in the Cascades over the decades, all of whom had found their way to the cabin for brief periods before moving on to whatever came next. "We're guardians now," one entry from 2010 read, "keeping the fire burning for those who are lost, those who are searching. The mountain chose us for this purpose, though we still don't fully understand why." Chen continued reading, absorbing stories that sounded more like fantasy than police evidence. The couple claimed to have met Amelia Earhart in 2003, described helping a group of lost children from the 1960s find their way home to whatever dimension they belonged in now. They wrote about learning to communicate with the spirits of the mountain, about understanding their role in the greater cosmic balance between the world of the living and the realm of the missing. A noise from the kitchen made Chen freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the wooden floor. "Detective Chen?" The voice was gentle, female, with the slight rasp of age. "We've been waiting for you." Chen's training kicked in immediately. She drew her weapon and called out, "Police! Show yourself with your hands visible." "There's no need for weapons here," the voice replied calmly. "We mean no harm. We never have." Chen moved carefully toward the kitchen, keeping her back to the wall and her gun at the ready. What she saw when she reached the doorway challenged everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the mysteries that lay between. A woman stood by the kitchen table, pouring coffee from a steaming pot into 2 mugs. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wearing clothes that looked like they could have come from 1994 or 2024. Her face was kind but tired, with the expression of someone who had seen and understood more than any human should have to bear. "Margaret Henderson?" Chen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled sadly. "I was, yes. In the world you come from, I suppose I still am, technically, though we exist somewhat differently here. You're supposed to be missing. You've been missing for 30 years. Missing from your world, perhaps. But not lost, Detective. Never lost. Would you like some coffee? You've had a long hike and we have much to discuss." Chen kept her weapon trained on the woman, though everything about the scene felt surreal rather than threatening. "Where is your husband? Where is Robert?" "He's tending to the fire," Margaret replied, nodding toward the living room. "He's always tending to the fire. It's become something of an obsession for him, though I suppose it's necessary. The fire is what keeps us anchored, keeps us able to exist in your dimension long enough to help others." Against every instinct of her police training, Chen found herself lowering her weapon slightly. The woman radiated no sense of danger, no indication of deception. If anything, she seemed almost relieved that Chen was there. "Help others?" Chen asked. "The lost ones. The missing. People disappear in these mountains all the time, Detective. Some by choice, some by accident, some by forces they don't understand. We help them find their way to where they need to be, whether that's back to your world or forward to whatever comes next." A man appeared in the doorway behind Margaret, and Chen's breath caught in her throat. Robert Henderson looked exactly as he had in the 1994 missing persons photographs. Mid-40s, brown hair with just a touch of grey, wearing the same flannel shirt and jeans he'd been wearing when he disappeared. But his eyes held depths that spoke of decades of experiences beyond normal human understanding. "Detective Chen," he said, his voice warm but carrying an otherworldly quality. "Thank you for coming. We know this is difficult to understand, but we need your help." "My help?" Chen repeated, still struggling to process what she was witnessing. "There are others," Margaret explained, setting the coffee mugs on the table. "Missing persons cases in your files that aren't really missing persons cases at all. People who, like us, were chosen by the mountain to serve a purpose, but some of them have forgotten their way, forgotten why they're here. They're lost between worlds, and it's causing complications." Robert nodded gravely. "The barrier between dimensions is weakening. People are disappearing who aren't supposed to disappear. Others are appearing in places they shouldn't be. The balance is shifting, and if we don't act soon, the consequences will extend far beyond these mountains." Chen holstered her weapon completely, though she remained alert. "This is insane. You're talking about supernatural phenomena, parallel dimensions, things that don't exist in the real world." "The real world," Margaret said with a slight smile, "is much larger and stranger than most people imagine, Detective. You've seen our cabin, our fire that has burned for 30 years without fuel or attention from the outside world. You've felt the impossibility of this place yourself. Deep down, you know we're telling the truth." Chen had to admit that the woman was right. Every rational explanation she had tried to construct for the scene around her had crumbled under scrutiny. No hoax could account for the diary entries that predicted her arrival, the fresh food in a cabin without electricity, the fire that defied the laws of physics. "Even if I believe you," Chen said slowly, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" Robert and Margaret exchanged a look that spoke of long years of shared understanding. "Help us find the others," Robert said. "There are 5 missing persons in your current case files who are like us, chosen but lost. They're scattered throughout the Pacific Northwest, existing in spaces between your world and ours. We can give you their locations, help you understand how to reach them, but we need someone from your world to make contact, to help guide them back to their purpose. And if I refuse," Margaret's expression grew solemn, "the barriers will continue to weaken, more people will disappear. The missing will begin appearing in populated areas, causing panic and potentially catastrophic disruptions to reality as most people understand it. Eventually, the two worlds will begin to merge in ways that could destroy both." Chen sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, her mind reeling with the implications of what she was hearing. She thought of her oath as a police officer, her duty to protect and serve. She thought of the dozens of missing persons cases that had haunted her throughout her career, families left without answers, searching desperately for loved ones who had simply vanished. "How do I know you're not just two people who've been living off the grid for 30 years, making up elaborate stories to avoid facing missing persons charges?" Robert smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the software engineer he had once been. "Because, Detective, you're going to witness something that will remove all doubt from your mind." He walked to the fireplace and placed his hand directly into the flames. Instead of burning, his flesh seemed to absorb the fire, glowing briefly with an inner light before returning to normal. When he withdrew his hand, it was completely unharmed. "We exist between states now," he explained calmly. "Neither fully alive in the way you understand life, nor dead in any traditional sense. The fire sustains us, connects us to the energy of the mountain, allows us to serve our purpose as guides and guardians." Chen stared at his unblemished hand, then at Margaret's serene face, then at the impossible fire that continued to burn without consuming its fuel. Every law of nature she had ever learned was being systematically shattered, yet she found herself not in denial, but in a strange state of acceptance. Perhaps this was what it felt like when the world revealed its hidden layers, when the curtain between the mundane and the miraculous was finally pulled aside. "Tell me about the missing 5, she said quietly. Margaret smiled, and for the first time since Chen had arrived, she looked truly hopeful. "Their names are in your files already. You'll recognize them when we tell you their stories. But, Detective, you should know, once you begin this journey, once you step fully into our world of the lost and found, you can never entirely return to the way things were before. You'll always know the truth about what exists in the spaces between normal and impossible." Chen thought about her empty apartment back in town, her solitary life, her career built on solving puzzles and finding truth. Perhaps this was exactly the kind of truth she had always been searching for without knowing it. "I'm listening," she said, and as Margaret Henderson began to tell her about 5 missing persons who weren't missing at all, but lost in the spaces between worlds, Detective Sarah Chen felt herself stepping across a threshold she had never known existed, into a reality where the impossible was simply another word for the not yet understood. The fire crackled in the hearth, eternal and unexplained, and somewhere in its dancing flames, Chen thought she could see glimpses of all the other lost souls who had found their way to this cabin over the decades, seeking answers, finding purpose, and discovering that sometimes disappearing from one world was the only way to save another. Margaret Henderson walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the cabin and withdrew a manila folder that looked impossibly fresh despite the decades that had supposedly passed. She placed it on the kitchen table in front of Detective Chen, and as she opened it, Chen recognized the familiar format of missing persons files. "These 5 cases have crossed your desk in the past 2 years, Margaret said softly. "You've wondered about them, haven't you? Felt like there was something different about these disappearances compared to the others." Chen examined the first file. Thomas Brennan, age 34, last seen hiking the Olympic Peninsula in September 2022. The case had bothered her because Brennan was an experienced outdoorsman, someone who wouldn't simply get lost or take unnecessary risks. His car had been found at a trailhead, his camping gear missing, but no trace of him had ever been discovered despite extensive search efforts. "Thomas found one of the gateway locations," Robert explained, moving to stand behind his wife. "There are 7 spots throughout the Pacific Northwest where the barrier between worlds is thin enough for people to slip through accidentally. Most find their way back within hours, with no memory of what happened. But some, like Thomas, are meant for something more." "Gateway locations?" Chen asked, though part of her already understood what they meant. "Places where our dimension intersects with yours," Margaret continued. "They've existed for thousands of years, long before European settlers arrived. The indigenous peoples knew about them, respected them, understood their purpose. But as more people moved into these areas, as the wilderness became more accessible, more souls began falling through the cracks." Chen opened the second file. Maria Santos, 28, a marine biologist who had disappeared while conducting research at Ruby Beach in November 2022. Santos had been studying tide pool ecosystems when she simply vanished, leaving behind only her research equipment and a notebook filled with increasingly erratic observations about temporal inconsistencies in water temperature patterns. Maria was special, Robert said. She could sense the gravitational anomalies that mark gateway locations. Her scientific mind was trying to rationalize what she was experiencing, but her intuition knew she had discovered something unprecedented. The third file contained information about Dr. James Rutherford, a retired geology professor who had gone missing during a solo camping trip in the North Cascades in March 2023. At 67, Rutherford was older than the typical missing hiker, but his academic background in earth sciences had made him particularly sensitive to the unusual geological properties around gateway sites. James was conducting unofficial research into magnetic field variations in the mountains, Margaret explained. He had theories about dimensional portals that were remarkably accurate, though he didn't realize how close he was to proving them. Chen felt a chill as she recognized patterns in the cases that she had never consciously noticed before. Each person had been intelligent, intuitive, and drawn to locations that were now revealing themselves to be more than simple wilderness areas. The fourth file belonged to Rebecca Kim, a 31-year-old photographer who had vanished while documenting old-growth forests in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in August 2023. Her camera equipment had been found scattered across several acres, with the final photographs on her memory card showing images that made no logical sense. Trees that appeared to exist in multiple seasons simultaneously, shadows that fell in impossible directions, and in one frame, what appeared to be figures in period clothing from different historical eras standing together in a forest clearing. Rebecca saw too much too quickly, Robert said grimly. She became lost between multiple timeline streams. She's been experiencing fragments of the past and future simultaneously, unable to anchor herself in any single moment. The final file was the most recent and the most troubling. David Park, a 26-year-old search and rescue volunteer, had disappeared in January 2024 while leading a team looking for Rebecca Kim. His fellow rescuers reported that Park had simply vanished mid-sentence while examining tracks near a creek bed. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, as if he had never existed at all. David's disappearance was different, Margaret said, her voice heavy with concern. He wasn't drawn to a gateway location naturally. He was pulled through while trying to help Rebecca. His connection to our world is unstable, artificial. If we don't reach him soon, he could be lost permanently between dimensions. Chen studied the 5 files, noting details that now seemed significant in ways they hadn't before. How long have you known about these people? We become aware of new arrivals almost immediately, Robert replied. The mountain tells us in ways that are difficult to explain. We feel their confusion, their fear, their gradual understanding of what has happened to them. Usually we can guide them from here, help them find their purpose, or show them the way back to your world. But these 5 are scattered, disconnected from the central energy source. The fire, Chen said, understanding beginning to dawn. Exactly. The fire here is more than just flames and heat. It's a focal point, a beacon that connects all the gateway locations and helps lost souls navigate between worlds. But something has been interfering with that connection lately. The 5 we've told you about are drifting further from the network, becoming trapped in isolated pockets of existence. Margaret walked to the fireplace and placed her hand near the flames. The fire flickered in response, and for a moment Chen could swear she saw faces in the dancing light. 5 faces that matched the photographs in the missing persons files. They're calling for help, Margaret whispered, but their calls are growing weaker. Thomas has been alone in a temporal loop for over a year, reliving the same day repeatedly. Maria is trapped underwater in a tidal zone that exists outside normal space-time. James is lost in a cave system that spans multiple geological eras simultaneously. Rebecca is fragmenting across different timeline streams, and David is fading from existence altogether. Chen stood up from the table, her mind racing with questions and implications. Even if I believe everything you're telling me, how am I supposed to help them? I'm just a detective. I don't have supernatural powers or interdimensional travel abilities. Robert smiled gently. You have something more important than supernatural powers, detective. You have belief. You've accepted the truth of what you're seeing here, which means you can serve as an anchor point for the lost souls. Your presence in their isolated dimensions will give them a connection back to the real world, a way to remember who they are and find their way to where they need to be. It's not without risk, Margaret added seriously. Entering the spaces where they're trapped will expose you to the same forces that captured them. You'll experience things that will challenge your sanity, your understanding of reality, your very sense of self. And there's always the possibility that you could become lost as well. Chen thought about her life, her career, her sense of purpose. She had become a detective because she wanted to help people, to solve mysteries, to bring closure to families who had lost loved ones. This was simply a larger version of that same calling, even if the methods were beyond anything she had ever imagined. How do we start? Margaret and Robert exchanged another of their wordless communications, and Chen could see relief in both their faces. Thomas is the closest and the most stable, Robert said. His temporal loop is centered around a lake about 15 miles northeast of here. If we can break his cycle and restore his connection to the network, it will strengthen our ability to reach the others. We'll need to leave soon, Margaret added. The barriers between worlds are strongest during daylight hours. We have maybe 6 hours before the dimensional boundaries become too unstable for safe travel. Chen looked around the impossible cabin one more time, at the fire that burned without fuel, at the couple who had been missing for 30 years but appeared younger than they should be, at the evidence that everything she thought she knew about reality was merely the surface of something much deeper and more complex. What do I need to bring? Robert handed her a backpack that hadn't been there moments before. Supplies for the journey. Food, water, equipment that will function properly in dimensional transition zones. And this. He pressed a small crystal into her palm. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own internal light. A piece of the eternal fire, he explained. It will serve as your compass and your protection. As long as you hold it, you'll be able to find your way back to this dimension, no matter how deep into the spaces between worlds you travel. Margaret embraced Chen gently, and the detective was surprised to find that the woman felt completely solid and real despite her otherworldly nature. Remember, Margaret whispered, the lost souls you're about to encounter have been isolated for months or years. They may not immediately recognize that you're there to help them. Some may have forgotten their human identities entirely. You'll need to be patient, compassionate, and above all, you'll need to help them remember who they were before they became lost. Chen shouldered the backpack and tucked the crystal safely into her jacket pocket. As she did, she felt a strange sensation, as if the very air around her was becoming more fluid, more responsive to her thoughts and intentions. One more thing, Robert said as they prepared to leave the cabin. Time works differently in the spaces where we're going. You may experience hours or days during your journey, but when you return to your own world, only minutes will have passed. Don't let that disorientation overwhelm you. Trust the crystal to guide you back to linear time. They stepped out of the cabin into what should have been the familiar Washington forest, but Chen immediately noticed that the landscape looked subtly different. The trees seemed taller, older, and the light filtering through the canopy had a quality that reminded her of very early morning or very late evening, regardless of the actual time of day. The journey to Thomas begins now, Margaret said, pointing toward what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary hiking trail. Follow the path until it diverges. When you see two trails where there should be one, take the path that seems less real. It will lead you to the lake where Thomas is trapped. How will I know when I've found him? You'll know, Robert assured her. And detective, when you find him, don't be surprised if he doesn't immediately recognize that you're real. He's been talking to echoes and shadows for so long that he may think you're just another illusion. Chen started down the trail, and with each step she took, she felt herself moving further away from the world she had always known. The forest around her began to shimmer and shift, showing glimpses of what it had been in other seasons, other years, other centuries. She saw Native American hunting parties moving silently between the trees, early loggers with their massive saws, and hikers from decades past, all occupying the same space at the same time. The crystal in her pocket grew warmer, and she understood that it was responding to the dimensional instability around her. She pressed forward, following the trail that seemed to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, she reached the divergence point Robert had described. Two paths stretched ahead of her. One that looked like a normal hiking trail worn smooth by countless boots, and another that seemed somehow less substantial, as if it were painted on the air rather than carved into the earth. Chen took the less real path. Immediately, the world around her shifted dramatically. The forest became a kaleidoscope of overlapping images, the same trees in spring bloom, summer fullness, autumn colors, and winter bareness, all existing simultaneously. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, but looked transparent, as if she were walking on glass, suspended over vast depths. And then she heard it. A voice calling out in confusion and fear. "Hello? Is someone there? Please? I've been walking for so long and I can't find my way back to the trailhead. The sun keeps setting and rising, but I never get tired and my watch stopped working days ago." Chen followed the voice through the shifting landscape until she reached a lake that defied every law of nature she had ever learned. The water reflected not the sky above, but dozens of different skies from different times of day and different seasons. In the center of the lake, on a small island that flickered in and out of existence, stood a man in hiking gear. Thomas Brennan looked exactly as he had in his missing persons photograph, despite having been gone for over a year. He was calling out to empty air, having conversations with people who weren't there, reliving the same confused attempts to find his way home over and over again. "Thomas!" Chen called out, her voice carrying across the impossible water. He turned toward her, and she could see the hope and desperation in his eyes. "Are you real?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Please tell me you're real. I've been seeing people all around this lake, but when I try to talk to them, they disappear. I keep thinking I've found other hikers, but they turn out to be just reflections or echoes, or my own mind playing tricks on me." Chen pulled the crystal from her pocket, and its light cut through the dimensional confusion like a beacon. Thomas's eyes locked onto it, and for the first time since she had seen him, his expression showed clarity rather than confusion. "You are real," he breathed. "That light, it's warm, it's alive. How did you find me? How did you get here?" "I'm Detective Sarah Chen, Thomas. I'm here to help you get home." "Home?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "I don't even know where here is anymore. I've been walking the same trails for what feels like months, but the seasons keep changing around me, and I never get hungry or tired. Sometimes I see my campsite exactly where I left it, but when I try to reach it, I end up back at this lake. Other times I see people from my past, my ex-wife, my college friends, my dead father, and they all tell me different things about how to get out of this place." Dear Chen waded into the lake, and to her amazement the water felt perfectly normal, despite its impossible appearance. As she got closer to Thomas, she could see that he was flickering slightly, as if he weren't entirely present in any single moment. Thomas, listen to me carefully. You're not lost in the normal sense. You've slipped through a dimensional barrier into a space between worlds. The reason you keep experiencing the same day over and over is because you're trapped in a temporal loop that's disconnected from linear time. That's impossible, Thomas said. But even as he spoke, Chen could see recognition in his eyes. Although, I have been wondering why nothing makes sense anymore. Why I can't remember eating or sleeping, why my watch stopped working, why the sun seems to move in circles rather than following its normal path. Chen reached the island and extended her hand to Thomas. Take my hand. The crystal I'm carrying is connected to a beacon that can guide us back to normal reality. But you have to trust me, and you have to want to leave this place. Thomas stared at her outstretched hand. What if I take your hand and you disappear like all the others? What if this is just another trick my mind is playing on me? Then you'll be exactly where you are now, Chen replied. But if I'm real, if I can help you get home, then staying here means you'll be trapped in this loop forever. Thomas reached out slowly and grasped Chen's hand. The moment their skin made contact, the world around them exploded into motion. The lake began spinning like a whirlpool. The overlapping seasons collapsed into a single moment, and Chen felt herself and Thomas being pulled upward through layers of reality. They emerged on a normal hiking trail next to a perfectly ordinary lake, with Thomas's abandoned campsite visible on the far shore. Thomas gasped and stumbled, looking around in amazement at the stable, single-season forest surrounding them. "It's real," he whispered. "It's all real. The trees aren't changing, the sun is in the right place. I can hear birds singing normally instead of in those weird, echoing loops." Chen checked her phone and was amazed to find that they had cell service. "Thomas, I'm going to call for help. A search and rescue team will come get you and make sure you're okay, but I need you to do something for me." "Anything. When they ask you what happened, tell them you got lost and disoriented, that you hit your head and your memory is fuzzy. Don't try to explain the dimensional loop or the temporal distortion. They won't believe you, and it will only make things more complicated." Thomas nodded, still marveling at the normal behavior of sunlight and shadow around him. "Will I see you again? Will you tell me what really happened to me?" "Maybe someday," Chen replied. "For now, just focus on getting back to your life, back to the people who love you. And Thomas, if you ever feel drawn to isolated places in the wilderness, places that seem somehow different from their surroundings, trust that instinct and walk away." Chen called 911 and reported finding a missing hiker, then slipped away into the forest before the rescue team arrived. As she walked back toward the dimensional trail that would lead her to the Henderson cabin, she felt the crystal in her pocket pulse with warmth and satisfaction. 1 down, 4 to go. But even as she felt a sense of accomplishment, Chen knew that the remaining rescues would be far more challenging. Thomas had been trapped in a relatively stable temporal loop. The others were scattered across different types of dimensional spaces, each presenting unique dangers and complexities. Maria Santos was trapped underwater in a tidal zone that existed outside normal space-time. Dr. James Rutherford was lost in a cave system that spanned multiple geological eras. Rebecca Kim was fragmenting across different timeline streams, experiencing past and future simultaneously. And David Park was fading from existence altogether, his connection to reality becoming weaker with each passing hour. As Chen made her way back through the shifting forest toward the cabin, she realized that she was no longer just a detective investigating a missing persons case. She had become something else entirely, a bridge between worlds, a guide for lost souls, a guardian of secrets that existed in the spaces between the possible and impossible. The eternal fire was calling her home, and there were still 4 souls who needed her help to find their way back to the light. But first, she needed to report back to Robert and Margaret Henderson to plan the next phase of her journey into the spaces where the lost souls waited for rescue. The adventure was far from over, and Chen was beginning to understand that her life would never be the same. Some cases changed a detective's career. This case was changing her entire understanding of what it meant to exist. Detective Chen returned to the Henderson cabin as the sun began to set, though in this place between worlds, sunsets seemed to last for hours rather than minutes. The eternal fire burned brighter as she approached, as if responding to her successful rescue of Thomas Brennan. Robert and Margaret were waiting for her on the front porch, their faces showing both relief and concern. "We felt Thomas reconnect to the network," Margaret said as Chen climbed the wooden steps. "His temporal loop collapsed exactly as it should have. But we also sensed something else, a disturbance in the barriers between worlds. Your intervention has had consequences we didn't anticipate." Chen sank into one of the porch chairs, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion that hadn't touched her during the dimensional journey. "What kind of consequences?" Robert's expression was grave. "The other 4 lost souls felt Thomas's rescue. It's awakened them to the possibility of escape, but it's also made them more unstable. Maria is fighting against the tidal forces that have held her in place for months. James is trying to break through geological barriers that could collapse entire cave systems across multiple time periods. Rebecca is attempting to consolidate her scattered consciousness, which is causing timeline fractures. And David is using the energy surge to try to force himself back into full existence," Margaret finished. "If he succeeds without proper guidance, he could tear a permanent rift between dimensions." Chen pulled the crystal from her pocket. It was pulsing rapidly now, almost frantically, and she could feel a strange tugging sensation pointing in 4 different directions. "How much time do we have?" "Hours at most," Robert replied. "The dimensional instability is increasing exponentially. We need to reach all 4 of them before the barriers collapse completely." Margaret stood and walked to the edge of the porch. "There's something else, Detective. Something we haven't told you about your role in all of this." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What do you mean?" "Your ability to anchor lost souls, to serve as a bridge between worlds. It's not just because you believe in the impossible," Margaret said softly. "You have a natural connection to the dimensional network. You're what we call a guardian candidate." "A guardian candidate?" Robert joined his wife at the porch railing. "Every few decades, the mountain identifies someone who has the potential to become a permanent bridge between worlds. Someone who can help maintain the balance, guide lost souls, and protect both dimensions from the dangers that exist in the spaces between." Chen felt her world shift again, just as it had when she first saw the eternal fire. "You're saying I was chosen for this? That my entire life has been leading up to becoming some kind of interdimensional guardian?" "Not chosen exactly," Margaret corrected. "You always had the choice. But yes, your natural empathy, your drive to help others, your ability to accept impossible truths, these qualities marked you as someone who could serve this purpose if you chose to. And if I don't choose to," Robert's expression was gentle but serious, "then you complete these 4 rescues, return to your normal life, and the mountain will eventually find another candidate. But Detective, you should know that without a new guardian to help maintain the network, the dimensional barriers will continue to weaken. More people will become lost, the spaces between worlds will become more dangerous, and eventually, the balance that keeps both realities stable could collapse entirely." Chen stared out at the forest, watching as the trees flickered between different seasons and time periods. She thought about her life as a detective, her small apartment, her solitary existence focused on solving other people's problems. Then she thought about the 5 lost souls who needed her help, and all the others who might become lost in the future. "If I become a guardian, what happens to my old life?" "You would exist as we do," Margaret explained. Between worlds, aging slowly, serving as a guide and protector. You could still visit your dimension, still help solve cases and protect people, but your primary purpose would be maintaining the network and rescuing lost souls. And I would never truly belong to either world again. No, Robert said honestly, but you would belong to something larger than any single world. You would be part of the force that keeps multiple realities in balance. Chen closed her eyes and felt the crystal's pulse synchronizing with her heartbeat. When she opened them, her expression was resolute. Let's rescue the other 4 first. Then I'll decide about becoming a guardian. Margaret smiled. The mountain knew you would say that. It's one of the qualities that makes you suitable for this role. You always put helping others before making decisions about your own future. They prepared for the most dangerous phase of the mission. Robert and Margaret explained that the next 4 rescues would require Chen to travel deeper into interdimensional space than any human had ever gone and returned from. The risks were enormous. She could become trapped like the people she was trying to save, or worse, she could become lost in the spaces between spaces where even the eternal fire couldn't reach her. We'll need to split up, Robert said, studying a map that showed locations in dimensions Chen couldn't even perceive. Maria and James are relatively stable in their trapped states. You can rescue them with guidance from us. But Rebecca and David require direct intervention from experienced guardians. Margaret will go after Rebecca, he continued. Timeline fragmentation is delicate work, and Margaret has more experience with temporal repairs. I'll handle David's reintegration crisis. That leaves Maria and James for you. Chen studied the impossible map, noting locations that seemed to exist in underwater caves and underground caverns simultaneously. How do I breathe underwater while rescuing Maria? Margaret handed her a small device that looked like a cross between a scuba regulator and a crystal formation. Dimensional breathing apparatus. It will extract oxygen from the interdimensional energy fields around Maria's location, but be warned, the tidal forces there exist outside normal physics. You may experience gravity pulling in multiple directions simultaneously. And James? His situation is more complex, Robert explained. He's trapped in a cave system that spans multiple geological eras. You'll be walking through caverns that are simultaneously forming, existing in their prime, and crumbling to dust. The key is to follow the crystal's guidance and don't trust your normal senses of direction or causality. They synchronized their efforts, agreeing to begin the rescues at exactly midnight, when the dimensional barriers would be at their most fluid. Chen would start with Maria, whose underwater prison was closest to the cabin, then proceed to James in the temporal caves. Meanwhile, Robert and Margaret would handle the more dangerous missions of rescuing Rebecca and David. As midnight approached, Chen felt herself changing. The crystal had become warm against her skin, and she was beginning to perceive layers of reality that had been invisible to her just hours earlier. She could see the Henderson cabin existing in multiple time periods simultaneously, as it had been built in the 1980s, as it appeared during the couple's disappearance in 1994, as it existed now in its eternal state, and as it might exist in possible futures. It's starting, Margaret observed. Your guardian abilities are awakening. The more time you spend in interdimensional space, the more your perception will expand. Is that permanent? Probably, Robert replied. But it's not a curse, Detective. Enhanced perception allows you to help people in ways you never imagined possible. At the stroke of midnight, Chen found herself standing at the edge of a lake that definitely hadn't been there moments before. The water was crystal clear, but seemed to extend infinitely downward, and she could see Maria Santos suspended about 30 feet below the surface, surrounded by a bubble of air that flickered in and out of existence. Chen attached the dimensional breathing apparatus and waded into the impossible water. As she submerged, she immediately felt the tidal forces Margaret had warned her about. Gravity seemed to pull her downward, upward, and sideways simultaneously, as if the water existed in multiple orientations at once. Fighting against the disorienting forces, Chen swam toward Maria. The marine biologist was conscious, but appeared to be in a trance-like state. Her eyes open but unfocused, her body moving in slow motion, as if the water around her had different temporal properties. "Maria!" Chen called out, her voice somehow carrying clearly through the water thanks to the breathing apparatus. "Maria Santos, can you hear me?" Maria's eyes slowly focused on Chen, and her expression shifted from vacant confusion to desperate hope. "Are you real?" Maria asked, her voice distorted by the strange acoustics of the interdimensional water. "I've been trying to surface for months, but every time I swim upward, I end up deeper underwater. The tidal forces here don't follow any laws of physics, I understand. I'm real, and I'm here to get you out," Chen replied, reaching for Maria's hand. "But I need you to stop fighting the water and trust me completely. The forces here respond to intention and belief more than physical effort." "That's impossible," Maria said automatically, then laughed bitterly. "Although nothing about this place follows normal rules. I've been measuring water temperature fluctuations that span centuries, watching tides that move in directions that don't exist in normal three-dimensional space." Chen grasped Maria's hand and immediately felt the crystal in her pocket respond. The water around them began to shimmer and shift, and Chen focused her intention on rising to the surface, on returning to normal dimensional space. Instead of swimming upward, Chen allowed herself and Maria to float, trusting the crystal's guidance to navigate the impossible tidal forces. Gradually, they began to rise, passing through layers of water that seemed to exist in different time periods. Chen glimpsed ancient ocean floors, future coastal formations, and tidal pools that contained creatures from multiple evolutionary eras. They broke the surface gasping, emerging not in the interdimensional lake, but in a perfectly normal tidal pool at Ruby Beach, exactly where Maria had originally disappeared. Maria's research equipment was scattered around them, looking as if it had been abandoned just minutes ago rather than months. "How is this possible?" Maria asked, staring at her instruments in amazement. "I've been underwater for months, but everything here looks exactly as I left it." "Time works differently in the spaces between worlds," Chen explained, helping Maria to her feet. "You've been gone for months in your experience, but in this dimension you disappeared and returned in the same moment." Chen quickly called for emergency services, reporting that she had found the missing marine biologist, then slipped away before the rescue teams arrived. The crystal was already tugging her toward the next location, toward Dr. James Rutherford and the caves that spanned multiple geological eras. The journey to James's location took her through a forest that existed in a constant state of geological flux. Trees grew and died in minutes, mountains rose and eroded in fast forward, and Chen walked on ground that was simultaneously solid rock, loose soil, and ancient seabed. She found the cave entrance in a cliff face that flickered between limestone, granite, and volcanic rock. The opening was simultaneously a natural cavern, a mine shaft, and a futuristic tunnel carved by technologies that hadn't been invented yet. Inside the cave, Chen discovered that James Rutherford was experiencing the geological equivalent of Maria's temporal displacement. He was trapped in a cavern that was forming around him through millions of years of geological processes, all happening simultaneously. "Dr. Rutherford!" Chen called out, her voice echoing through chambers that existed in multiple time periods. "Who's there?" James's voice came from deeper in the cave system. "Please be careful. The rock formations here are unstable across multiple temporal dimensions. I've been trying to map the geological processes, but they're all happening at once. Formation, stability, erosion, all in the same space. Chen followed his voice through passages that changed around her with each step. Sometimes she was walking through caves formed by ancient water action, sometimes through lava tubes from volcanic activity, sometimes through tunnels carved by Ice Age glaciers. She found James in a central chamber, surrounded by rock formations that defied every principle of geology. Stalactites and stalagmites were growing and shrinking simultaneously, mineral deposits were forming and dissolving in fast motion, and the very walls of the cave seemed to be moving through millions of years of change in seconds. "Dr. Rutherford, I'm Detective Chen. I'm here to help you get out of this cave system." James looked at her with the same mixture of disbelief and hope she had seen in the other lost souls. "Detective, the geological processes here are incredible, but terrifying. I've been trying to document formations that represent millions of years of Earth history happening simultaneously, but I can't find a stable path out of the caves." "The paths aren't stable because you're trying to navigate using normal three-dimensional thinking," Chen explained, pulling out the crystal. Its light cut through the temporal confusion of the cave, revealing a single, stable route through the chaos. "Follow me, and don't try to understand what you're seeing. Trust the light to guide us to a stable geological period." James nodded and took Chen's extended hand. Together, they walked through the impossible cave system, passing through chambers that showed the Earth's history in fast forward and reverse. They saw the formation of the mountain range, the carving of valleys by ancient rivers, the advance and retreat of glaciers, all compressed into a journey that felt like minutes but encompassed geological ages. They emerged from a cave entrance in the North Cascades, with James's abandoned camping gear visible nearby. Like Maria, James stared in amazement at equipment that looked as if it had been left just moments before. Chen repeated the process of calling for rescue services and disappearing before officials arrived. 2 down, 2 to go. But she could feel through the crystal that the remaining rescues would be far more dangerous. Rebecca and David were in critical condition, and the dimensional barriers were becoming increasingly unstable. She made her way back toward the cabin, but the forest around her was now in constant flux. Trees were growing and dying in accelerated time. Seasons were changing every few minutes, and she could see ghostly figures from different time periods moving through the same spaces she was traveling. When she reached the cabin, she found Robert and Margaret preparing for their own rescue missions. Both looked more serious than she had ever seen them. "The timeline fractures around Rebecca are spreading," Margaret reported. "She's not just experiencing multiple time periods anymore. She's creating paradoxes that could unravel causality itself. And David's forced reintegration attempt is tearing holes in dimensional space," Robert added. "If we don't stabilize him soon, he could create a permanent rift that would allow dangerous entities from other dimensions to enter our reality." Chen felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "What can I do to help?" "You've done your part," Margaret said gently. "Your successful rescues of Thomas, Maria, and James have strengthened the network enough for us to attempt the more dangerous missions. But Detective, these next 2 rescues will determine whether you're ready to become a guardian." "How?" Robert's expression was grave. "Rebecca and David's situations are so dangerous that they require guardian-level abilities to resolve safely. If you come with us and successfully help with these rescues, it will mean you've already begun the transformation into a guardian. There would be no going back to your normal life." Chen looked at the eternal fire burning in the cabin, at the couple who had given up their normal existence to serve as protectors of lost souls, at the crystal in her hand that was pulsing with increasing urgency. "And if I don't help?" "Then Margaret and I attempt the rescues alone, with a much lower chance of success," Robert replied honestly. Rebecca could be lost forever in timeline fragmentation. David could disappear entirely from existence, and the dimensional rifts they're creating could threaten both our worlds. Chen thought about her life as a detective, her calling to help people, her growing understanding that some cases required sacrifices beyond anything she had ever imagined. She thought about all the missing persons cases that might never be solved if the dimensional network collapsed, all the families who would never know what happened to their loved ones. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Margaret smiled sadly. "We hoped you would say that. But Detective, you should know, this decision changes everything. Once you participate in Guardian-level rescues, you'll be connected to the network permanently. You'll age differently, exist differently, belong to the spaces between worlds as much as to any single reality." "I understand," Chen replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "Some cases require everything a detective has to give. This is one of those cases." They prepared for the final phase of the mission with the solemnity of people undertaking a sacred duty. Robert explained that Rebecca Kim was trapped in a photographic studio that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. She was experiencing every moment of her life from birth to death all at once, and her attempts to process this information were creating paradoxes that threatened the stability of linear time. "Margaret will lead that rescue because timeline work requires delicate precision," Robert continued. "One wrong move and Rebecca's timeline fractures could spread across decades, potentially erasing people from existence or creating impossible duplicate histories." David Park's situation was even more dangerous. His forced reintegration attempt was causing him to exist as multiple versions of himself simultaneously, some from different points in his life, some from alternate reality versions where he had made different choices. These overlapping versions were fighting for dominance, and their conflict was tearing holes in the fabric of reality itself. "I'll handle David's rescue," Robert said. "But Detective, your role will be crucial for both missions. You'll need to serve as an anchor point, using your connection to normal reality to help both Rebecca and David remember who they really are and choose a single timeline to exist in." Chen felt the crystal in her pocket growing almost hot now, responding to the dimensional chaos that Rebecca and David were creating. She could perceive layers of reality that she had never imagined existed, glimpses of possible futures, echoes of might-have-beens, shadows of people who existed in parallel dimensions. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was ready for. They began the final rescues at exactly 3 a.m., when the barriers between worlds reached their weakest point before dawn. Margaret disappeared into what looked like empty air, but which Chen now understood was a doorway to the timeline fractures surrounding Rebecca. Robert stepped through a shadow that led to the dimensional rifts where David was fighting for existence. Chen found herself standing in a space that existed between both rescue locations, serving as a focal point that connected all the fractured realities. She could see Margaret moving through a photography studio that existed in dozens of different time periods simultaneously, trying to help Rebecca choose a single moment to anchor herself in. She could see Robert surrounded by multiple versions of David Park, each one desperate to become the real David. Both rescues were failing. Rebecca was becoming more fragmented with each passing moment, her consciousness splitting across so many timelines that she was losing the ability to remember which version of herself was original. David's alternate selves were fighting so violently that they were tearing larger holes in reality with each conflict. Chen realized that the crystal in her pocket was no longer just warm. It was burning with the same intensity as the eternal fire itself. And suddenly she understood what she needed to do. She reached out with her mind, using abilities she didn't know she possessed, and connected herself directly to the dimensional network. Energy flowed through her from the eternal fire, through the crystal, into the spaces where Rebecca and David were trapped. "Rebecca!" Chen called out across multiple timelines. "You're not fragments of different people. You're one person experiencing time in a non-linear way. Choose the moment when you are happiest with your photography and anchor yourself there." "David!" she called into the dimensional rifts. "You're not competing versions of yourself. You're one person whose timeline was artificially split. Remember who you were before you disappeared, and choose that identity." The energy flowing through Chen was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She felt herself connected to every lost soul who had ever found their way to the Henderson cabin, to every person who had disappeared in the wilderness and found their way to the spaces between worlds. She was a bridge not just between individual dimensions, but between the concept of lost and found itself. Rebecca's timeline fractures began to heal as she focused on a single moment, the day she had taken her first photograph in the old-growth forest, the moment she had discovered her true calling as an artist. The multiple versions of her existence collapsed into that single powerful memory, and she became whole again. David's alternate selves stopped fighting as they remembered their shared identity, a search and rescue volunteer who had dedicated his life to helping lost people find their way home. The dimensional rifts began to close as all versions of David chose to exist as that single unified person. Both Rebecca and David found themselves back in normal reality. Rebecca at the forest location where she had originally disappeared, David at the creek bed where his rescue team had last seen him. Both had been gone for subjective months, but returned to their own dimension only minutes after they had originally vanished. Chen felt herself pulled back to the Henderson cabin as the dimensional network stabilized. She emerged in the main room to find Robert and Margaret waiting for her, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "You did it," Margaret said softly. "You saved them all. But more than that, you've proven that you have Guardian-level abilities. The network has accepted you as one of its protectors." Chen looked down at her hands and saw that they were glowing faintly with the same light as the eternal fire. She could feel her connection to the dimensional network humming in her consciousness, showing her the locations of other lost souls throughout the Pacific Northwest. "What happens now?" she asked. Robert smiled. "Now you choose. You can return to your life as a detective, keeping your enhanced abilities secret and using them to solve cases that others couldn't understand. Or you can embrace your role as a guardian, joining us in maintaining the balance between worlds and rescuing lost souls." Chen walked to the fireplace and placed her hand near the flames. They responded to her presence, burning brighter and warmer, welcoming her as one of their own. "If I become a guardian, will I still be able to help people in the normal world?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "In fact, you'll be able to help them in ways you never imagined. Mysterious disappearances, impossible crimes, cases that seem to defy explanation. You'll have the tools to solve them all." Chen thought about her life, her calling, her purpose. She had become a detective to help people find answers, to bring closure to families, to solve mysteries that others couldn't crack. Now she had the opportunity to do that on a scale beyond anything she had ever dreamed. "I accept," she said simply. The eternal fire flared brighter, and Chen felt herself changing on a fundamental level. She was still herself, still Detective Sarah Chen, but now she was also something more. A guardian of the spaces between worlds, a bridge between the possible and impossible, a protector of lost souls. "Welcome to the network," Robert said, embracing her gently. "You'll find that your life is about to become far more interesting." Margaret laughed, and for the first time since Chen had met her, she looked truly happy rather than sad. "And you'll never lack for cases to solve. The spaces between worlds are full of mysteries that need a detective's touch." Chen looked around the cabin that had become her new home, at the fire that would burn eternally, at her new partners in the impossible work of maintaining balance between dimensions. Outside, the forest was returning to normal, but she knew that normal was just one layer of a reality far more complex and wonderful than most people could imagine. Her phone rang. Her normal, everyday phone that somehow had signal in this place between worlds. The caller ID showed the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department. "Detective Chen," she answered. "Chen, it's Captain Rodriguez. We just got a weird call. 5 missing persons cases, all resolved simultaneously. People appearing exactly where they disappeared from, all claiming they just got lost and confused for a few minutes. The families are thrilled, but the whole thing is unusual." Chen smiled, looking at the eternal fire that would guide her through countless future rescues. "I'll write up the reports, Captain. Sometimes cases solve themselves in unexpected ways." "Yeah, well, whatever you did, keep doing it. Oh, and Chen, we just got another missing persons call. Hiker disappeared in the Olympic Peninsula yesterday. Family's pretty worried." "I'll take the case," Chen replied, already feeling the crystal in her pocket respond to the mention of another lost soul. "In fact, I have a feeling I'm going to be handling a lot more missing persons cases from now on." She hung up and turned to Robert and Margaret, who were both grinning. "Ready for your first official case as a guardian?" Margaret asked. Chen walked to the door of the cabin, looking out at a forest that was simultaneously normal and magical, ordinary and impossible. She could see the paths that led to other dimensions, feel the network of lost souls who might need her help, sense the mysteries that waited to be solved in the spaces between worlds. "I've been ready my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it until now." The eternal fire crackled behind her, and Detective Sarah Chen stepped out into her new role as a guardian of the impossible, ready to solve cases that existed in the spaces between reality and dreams. Some missing persons were truly missing, some were simply lost, and some were exactly where they needed to be, serving as bridges between worlds. And for the first time in her life, Chen felt like she was exactly where she belonged.